welcome to Headlines. This is Dovid Lichtenstein here in the Yeshiva Shalmaila.
We have the honor of having with us on the phone, I believe, perhaps the most prominent person to actually, exhibit his orthodoxy, to wear his yarmulke wherever he goes. It's an honor to have you with us. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Ben, the story of Hanukkah is an eternal story, and light and darkness change continually, depending on the period of time. If you were to look at the world today from an Orthodox Jew's point of view and say, or a Jew's point of view and say, who's the Antiochus? Who are the Maccabees? Who are the Misyavnim? Where do you see darkness and light taking the sort of the story of Hanukkah, looking at it through the prism of an Orthodox Jew today?
Well, I think that when it comes to who's Antiochus, I would say that it really comes in three forms, and they're movements that are broader than singular figures because we don't live in an age of empires per se. The three forms that I see Antiochus in are the anti-Semitism of the radical Islamic world. So this would be Iran, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah. The anti-Semitism of the radical left, which enables that anti-Semitism by essentially suggesting that it is just part of an intersectional coalition, that the Jews are uniquely successful on the world stage and therefore cannot be victims of anti-Semitism, that the state of Israel is a state that victimizes and is not, in fact, victimized, that the state of Israel ought to be the repository for all Western angst about multiculturalism. And then finally, the right-wing anti-Semitism that you see from some ethno-nationalist groups in Europe and some white supremacist groups in the United States. The threat there seems to me a lot less threatening globally. It's certainly very threatening in specific places, as we saw in Pittsburgh, but the threat globally seems to me much more aligned with the radical left anti-Semitism and the radical Islamic anti-Semitism that seems to have made common cause in targeting the state of Israel and Jews inside Europe as well. Directly in the case of radical Islamic anti-Semitism in Europe, and by proxy in the case of socialist and left anti-Semitism in Europe that enabled the radical Islamic anti-Semitism in Europe. As far as who the Maccabees are...
Let me interrupt. Ben, let me interrupt.
Sorry,
so would you say that, based upon what you're saying, organizations like the ADL, who are fighting the skinheads, aren't they fighting yesterday's anti-Semitism to a certain extent? Haven't they not realized, when Yaakov asks the angel his name, he says, Lama Zetishal Shmi. So the commentators say, you want to know the name, the face of anti-Semitism? I can't give you a name. It's constantly changing. You have to be on your toes. Is the ADL fighting? Is it an anachronism? Is it fighting yesterday's anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the ADL, because it is a left-leaning organization and sees the threat of anti-Semitism as right-wing anti-Semitism, it's not that what they're fighting doesn't exist. It's they are fighting an anti-Semitism that is significantly less threatening to Jews on the world stage and even in the United States than anti-Semitism of the radical left and the multicultural left and the radical Islamic left. The radical Islamic anti-Semitic movement. That is much more damaging to Jews. There's no question that that's the case statistically. Again, this is not to make light of white supremacist anti-Semitism, which victimizes Jews on a not infrequent basis throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. But if you're talking about global threats to the Jews, I don't think that you can place the white supremacists who shoot up synagogues in the United States on the same plane as the Iranian regime that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the map, or the radical Islamists in Europe who have made countries fully unlivable for Jews to the point that thousands of them are leaving every year for Israel.
And who are the Maccabees today?
I've always thought that that's the one part of the story that doesn't change. The folks who are willing to fight for the continuity of the Jewish people and of the Jewish religion and aren't willing to make compromises in their belief in order to maintain the survival of their people. Those are the Maccabees. Again, the story of Hanukkah is the story of a civil war, and the civil war inside Judaism has been ever present. It's always continuing. There are a lot of Jews who don't hold to any real form of Judaism. They hold to a cultural Judaism that allows them to proclaim minority status without any of the actual belief systems or sacrifices that are inherent in a Torah-based Judaism. That's not authentic. That's basically leftism masquerading as Judaism, and I don't see, and I don't see that as part of the Maccabee movement. In terms of Israel, I think that the future of the state of Israel, I've always felt this, lies very strongly with the religious Zionist movement and with people who both believe in the existence of the State of Israel and the future of the State of Israel and fighting for the State of Israel, and also believe in the biblical basis of the State of Israel. Because if you don't believe in the biblical basis of the State of Israel and its necessity for existence, it's going to be very difficult to motivate folks to continue fighting every day on the front lines over there. And that's said with respect to a lot of secular Jews who are in the military in Israel and still believe in the existence of the state, but you do need a strong philosophical grounding in why you believe a state should exist. And I believe the same thing is true in the United States for folks who believe in the future of the United States. You need a strong philosophical grounding in why state is special and has a right to exist.
And who are the Misyavnim today? The Misyavnim were the Hellenized Jews who sort of converted to the Yevanim, etc. Who would you say, who's the protagonist? Who plays that role today?
Well, I mean, as I've said, I mean, I think that the Misyavnim never change. And it's always the same group of secularized Jews who believe that they can abandon core tenets of Judaism, still maintain a cultural Judaism, and then masquerade as representatives of authentic Judaism. You see a lot of groups like J Street who come to mind. But they're, again, an enormous number of secular Jews who seem to only care about Judaism when Jews are victimized at a Pittsburgh temple, but don't care about Judaism when Jews are slaughtered in the streets of Jerusalem, or when 300 rockets a day are falling on innocent Jews in Israel, or when Jews are being slaughtered in France or in Sweden. Then they don't care. Then anti-Semitism is only a matter of concern when it can be used as a club against politically right-wing foes in the United States or in Europe. It's never a real concern because in the end the identity is beyond the Judaic bounds. There was an op-ed in the New York Times by a secular Jew specifically talking about why he was uncomfortable celebrating Hanukkah, because he considered himself one of the Misyavnim. Yeah. And I thought, this is exactly right. I mean, at least this person is being intellectually honest.
So do you see in the United States an increase in anti-Semitism, in particular under certain aspects of this administration, which seems to appeal to a more right-wing demographic, etc.? Has that caused, in your eyes, an increase in anti-Semitism or not?
So it depends on a couple of questions. First of all, I don't see a radical increase in violence against Jews. I think the statistics that have been cited are largely based on increased reporting and have been widely debunked. With that said, as the number one recipient of anti-Semitism on the internet in 2016, I can say that there was an alt-right white supremacist base that felt that President Trump was winking and nodding at them during the 2016 election and felt emboldened to express anti-Semitic viewpoints in a way that I certainly had not seen before in my career. But again, I think that the real anti-Semitism that folks ought to worry about is the polarization around anti-Semitism by the political left. I mean, the political left has decided they're full-scale going to ignore anti-Semitism. Since the 2016 election, I don't see any evidence that the Trump administration has acted in anti-Semitic fashion. I don't see any evidence that they have ignored anti-Semitism. I don't see any evidence that they have been consciously emboldening anti-Semitism. I think that the sort of winking and nodding at the alt-right that went on in 2016 and part of 2017, I think that was ugly, but I don't know if that was specifically anti-Semitic in origin, or just President Trump has an unfortunate tendency to sort of pat people on the back who treat him well publicly, no matter how bad those people are. As far as the real threat of anti-Semitism, let's face this. I mean, the reality is that the rise in anti-Semitism in America's major cities is not being driven by the political right. It's being driven by the multicultural left. The New York Times admitted it as much. The New York Times had an article a few weeks back in which it talked about the number of anti-Semitic incidents that happened in New York City, and Jews walking down the street being punched by folks, being attacked, graffiti incidents at synagogues. And they couldn't tie a single one of those incidents to a white supremacist or right-wing group, and so they simply didn't report it. And the New York Times openly acknowledged they didn't report it because it didn't allow them to draw a specific line to President Trump and the right wing. The fact is that you have mainstream members of the Democratic Party who not only associate with Louis Farrakhan, they uphold Louis Farrakhan. Mainstream members of the Democratic Party, leaders in the new Democratic Party, who call for the anti-Semitic boycotts of sanctions movement against Israel to be successful. And you see the leadership of the Democratic Party kowtowing to this. I mean, Chuck Schumer, supposedly pro-Jewish Chuck Schumer, pro-Israel Chuck Schumer, was a fan of Keith Ellison for the head of DNC like a year and a half ago. So I'm much more worried about the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism inside of one of the political parties than the fringe elements of anti-Semitism that tend to hang around on the outskirts of the Republican Party.
Now, what has the effect been on, quote-unquote scandals, unsavory practices that, they they find when a Jew is involved in a scandal, the New York Times, it licks its chops, it relishes it, it puts it out there. Do you find that these scandals have an effect on anti-Semitism? Is it overrated, etc.?
Well, I mean, I think that anti-Semites rarely need an excuse to be angry at Jews. I think that it's a little bit exaggerated when folks, in my opinion, suggest, well, there's a Bernie Madoff scandal, this was bad for the Jews, or there's a Harvey Weinstein scandal that's bad for the Jews. The same folks who attribute Harvey Weinstein to the Jews would be attributing everything bad to the Jews in any case. I don't see a lot of people who are convinced of Jewish power by Harvey Weinstein who weren't already convinced of Jewish power. I think that the rule about Jews is the same rule that most people should hold in their everyday lives about most things, which is most people are not spending a lot of time thinking about you or us collectively or Jews in general, unless they're already thinking about Jews in general, in which case there's a good shot they're an anti-Semite in the first place. So I'm not. This is why I've never really held by the idea that if the Jews sort of recede to the political background, if they become less prominent, then suddenly people will care less about them. I think that God has designed a world in which people tend to care in outsized fashion about the fate of the Jews, for good and for ill.
Because when you have gentlemen like Alan Dershowitz defending Jeffrey Epstein while being an outspoken advocate for Israel, or have red line names like Ben Brafman defending Harvey Weinstein, do you think does any damage to the to the movement to protect Israel when Alan Dershowitz's largest supporter is also at the same time defending Jeffrey Epstein?
So yes, there, just because Dershowitz is such a prominent defender of Israel. So anytime you have a defender of a particular principle who goes down over a scandal, it's damaging to that movement. But I don't think that is per se connected to the Jewishness of Alan Dershowitz. I don't think it's like, well, Alan Dershowitz is defending Jeffrey Epstein because he's Jewish and he's defending Israel because he's Jewish. I don't think it's that. I think it's a guy who is a strong defender of Israel is getting correctly raked over the coals for his association with Jeffrey Epstein. The same people who would attribute, the Epstein relationship to Jewishness, those are the folks who I think would be anti-Semitic in any case.
Do you think that it's irresponsible for people like Alan Dershowitz to be defending people like Epstein or Brafman?
Yeah, but I think that Alan Dershowitz has defended a lot of bad people in his career. So,
well, do you see a moral issue with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I've said so widely in the past. I think that defending people who you believe are guilty of terrible crimes certainly presents a serious moral quandary. Now, I'm not sure that, again, I'm not a halachist, but I don't think that, would it be something that I would do? Would I feel comfortable defending somebody who I think was a murderer? No, I typically would not, even if I could justify that by saying, well, the system requires that this person have a lawyer. Right, but the system doesn't require that you do everything in your power to shade the truth that the person gets off. Like, that's not something that is required.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, you wear a yarmulke. Tell me a little bit about it. Is it at times you either regretted it, were you fearful of it? It's very common for, people who wear yarmulkes, but when they go into a particular meeting where they fear anti-Semitism or they feel some type of a negative inflection to take it off, yet you quite courageously wear a yarmulke. Give me some of your thoughts about that.
I mean, the truth is that people ask me about it a lot, and I've never really thought about it too much because it's just something that I do. I mean, it's like waking up in the morning and putting on pants. Like, it's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've been wearing a yarmulke since I was 11 years old, and my family's Baal Tshuva. So when I went to middle school and started wearing a yarmulke in middle school, I just never took it off because this was who I am. This is my way of life, and why should I change that based on which audience I'm going to be speaking to? If somebody has a problem with that, they can stick it. So it's never really occurred to me to take off the yarmulke. It does what it's supposed to do, right? I mean, it's a reminder to me that my behavior is on display, and I haven't, like everyone else, I haven't always lived up to my own best standards for behavior, but I think that's the purpose of having a constant reminder so that you know when you're not and you try and fix it.
So let's face it, you've taken a strong conservative political position, which many people agree with, but since it's political, many people disagree with. And, if you go on the blogs after you've spoken, there's all kinds of hatred, and many of it will be about, the Jew, the this, the that. Do you ever wonder, well, maybe, it could cause some type of a backlash towards Judaism, the fact that I'm taking some type of a conservative position that 50% of the country will disagree with?
Not particularly. I mean, again, I think that the only representatives of Jews supposedly have been liberal Jews in public for a very long time, and those people are not representing anything remotely resembling a Judaic viewpoint. It's just that people identify them as Jews by their last names, or because they'll say sometimes that they're Jewish and that they go to Yom Kippur before breaking for lunch. So if I have the choice between being a representative of what I think is a more authentic brand of Judaism, or letting other people who are completely disconnected from any authenticity in Judaism speak publicly about Jewish principles, I would much rather it be me. Now, that doesn't mean I'm the best advocate for everything that's out there, right? Again, when people ask me halakhic questions, I almost always defer to a rabbi because they know the answers better than I do. But when it comes to deep-seated moral questions, I don't think that you need to be a rabbi to understand basic Jewish principle, which is why the vast majority of Jews are not rabbis. So, I've never thought that anti-Semites need an excuse to be anti-Semitic. Anti-Semites attribute communism to the Jews. They attribute capitalism to the Jews. They attribute nationalism to the Jews. They attribute internationalism to the Jews. They attribute parochialism to the Jews. They attribute perversion to the Jews. So they don't need an excuse from me to be anti-Semitic. All that I can hope is that if people are going to hate Jews, at least they should hate us for the right reasons, because we're saying things that are important.
Okay. I could see why you graduated summa cum laude, Okay, Orthodox Jews in particular are infatuated with Trump. And look, you're a parent, right? And you have the sense to understand, look, the man's character may be somewhat questionable, to be polite, whereas his actions as a president, on the other hand, in many ways are far superior than the presidents that preceded him. But many teenagers or people just who don't have cutting intellect don't make that differentiation, and they've put Trump on a pedestal. And in effect, we're putting somebody who's, an adulterer, a thief, etc. I think all 10 commandments, we could safely assume, if not 10, maybe 8 of them, he's trampled on with relish. Do you worry that putting, historically, presidents have been seen also as moral figures? Maybe even Kennedy, while he was alive, maybe is the exception. But certainly George W., I had dinner with him a beautiful person, this type of person you could see, you would introduce to a young woman and say, I have a fabulous boy for you, either one of the Bushes, etc. Do you see having a president who many people would agree is morally, I don't want to use any word. Compromise, thank you. And putting him on a pedestal, do you see that as, now a teenager understands, well, the president of the United States, who is the most powerful man, the most quoted man, he's in the paper every single day, he's in news all day, and he also did what? So does that make that, and therefore, in effect, sort of undermine the character, both as Jews and as human beings?
I mean, yes, putting anybody on a pedestal who does not deserve to be on a pedestal is a serious problem. And I think that this has been a real generational divide for a lot of people, both Jews and non-Jews. What you see is that older Jews tend to put him on a pedestal because he's doing a lot of good things, and they see politics as transactional, and so they're not seeing him as much as like a moral voice, and they're not expecting him to. So they're just looking at all the stuff he's done, and they're saying a lot of this is great. And then you're seeing younger Jews and younger people generally, and they're saying, well, I thought the president was supposed to be a moral person. I was always told growing up that the president was supposed to be a moral person, and this president is not a character of moral fabric. So what exactly are you guys going on about? And because people lack cognitive dissonance, it's very difficult for a lot of people to say, I like a lot of what he's doing, but personally he's sort of a schmuck, right? Like, it's very difficult for people to make that mental distinction. And because of that, that has created a fair bit of tension, I think, even in Orthodox circles between younger people and older people. Now, again, I think that the solution to a lot of this is to recognize there are two things we can do. One, we can tell the truth about what's happening. As you say, you can like a lot of what the president's doing. I just went to the Hanukkah party at the White House. I like a lot of what the president's doing. I'm very friendly with a lot of members of his administration. And also, the man has a serious lack of moral character. I mean, this is just, these two things can simultaneously exist. That's okay. It's not okay in the sense that we're like happy with it, but let's not pretend that something is not happening when it's happening. The second thing that we can do is we can recognize that, in general, we should actually not be looking to presidents for moral character. We can talk about, looking to our presidents for moral character, but here's the reality of the situation in terms of moral character. You're right. I think George W. Bush was a moral man. Bill Clinton was a deeply immoral man. Barack Obama, on a personal level with his family, was a moral guy who was deeply immoral in politics. Donald Trump does a lot of stuff I like, not a man of morality. maybe you could say that Reagan and H.W. were men of more character, but you can't really say that about Richard Nixon. You can't really say that about LBJ. You can't really say that about JFK. So we've had a lot of presidents with very checkered histories with regard to morality. It's just that Trump is a lot more open about exactly where he differs from traditional morality, where he sins and all the rest. I think that we've made an error in parenting if we think that we are supposed to direct our children to look to the President of the United States as a moral figure. We should be able to pick, not based on the office, but based on the person, who we want our children to emulate. I would never tell my kids, the President is always someone you should emulate. Why? A lot of people occupy that office. I would tell my kids, emulate my father, emulate your rabbi, emulate your mom, emulate, a bunch of great people who are around you, and that'll set you on a better path for life. It's pretty rare that you have a person in public life who you think, okay, that's a person that I definitely want my kids to emulate.
Yeah. I'll tell you an interesting biblical reference to this. It says King Saul, made one mistake with Amalek, and he lost his kingship. And King David made multiple mistakes with women, and he didn't. So the Malbim, who was a commentator who lived around 300 years ago, 200 years ago, he said, well, one was a political mistake, an actionable military mistake that he made, which the entire country suffered because of with Amalek. So therefore, he lost his kingship. What Dovid did in his private life did not affect the people, and therefore he did not lose his status as king, notwithstanding the error that he made. So we see already the biblical divide between something that you do in your personal life and something that is in your public life. As sort of, I don't want to compare Chas v'Shalom these people to what's going on now, but this concept that you mentioned as a biblical. Now, what about Trump?
Yeah, and I would add one thing to that analysis, and that is that while I agree with the analysis, and I've heard it spoken by a lot of folks, the question is, what is our role in as people who are watching this and bringing up kids in this world? God gets to decide whether Shaul stays king or whether he doesn't, and God gets to decide whether Dovid stays king or whether he doesn't. But it is our job to be both Shmuel and Nathan, meaning that it's our job to actually call things as we see them, and then God decides what happens after that.
Okay. So the takeaway is that we look at the president as a chief executive officer and not as some type of a moral demagogue to aspire to.
Right, and also it is incumbent on us that when the president sins personally or publicly, that it is our job to call that out, just as we would with anybody else. And hiding it for the purposes of trying to cover for that person is rarely either a politically winning strategy or a morally useful strategy. Like, I find that when I talk to young people, if I were to say to young people, President Trump, great guy, terrific leader, moral character, just moral on every level, young people would laugh, and they'd be right to laugh. But if I say to them, and this is as somebody who's likely to vote for President Trump in 2020, if I say to them, President Trump's done a lot of stuff that I like, I think he has a lot of moral flaws, a lot of them, and I disagree with a lot of his behavior. Younger people are more likely to take my argument seriously in favor of his benefits if I'm honest about his flaws.
So as an honest person then, would you, if you had a Democrat running who you thought was, had the correct political positions, was of the correct character, et cetera, maybe a Michael Bloomberg, could you see yourself voting for a Democrat?
I wouldn't vote for Bloomberg, but if there were a Democrat who fulfilled more boxes politically for me than President Trump and were of higher moral character, sure. I don't think the party labels matter nearly as much as the policies, and you have to weigh those things in the balance, every time. But I think the likelihood of the Democrats running anybody who would even be mildly palatable to me is virtually zero. They've moved in a radical direction.
Yeah, I'm just using it as a metaphor. In other words, many people, they're Democrats, every Republican is bad. Many Republicans, every Democrat is bad. And I think a more nuanced position is, look, there's no bad, there's no good. Let's look at the person, his position, his character, et cetera, and let's decide who his opponents and who is the more appropriate leader, rather than I'm blue or I'm red. That's what my takeaway is from what you said.
Oh, yeah. For me, the part, all that matters to me is the principle. The parties are just vehicles for preservation of the principle. If the parties aren't preserving that principle, then I leave the party.
So here's this. Trump has been embraced by the Jews of this country, certainly the Orthodox Jews. The Reform, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, the Reform, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's right.
But the Orthodox embrace him, and Israel has embraced him. I mean, I think the Times recently had an article that said 3 countries we're closer to because of Trump. One of them is Israel, and he's a demigod over there. In fact, the ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, who represented me for many years, is a demigod in Israel because he's Trump's, emissary. Are we being a little short-sighted? Because, there's presidents come and presidents go. We've so aligned ourselves with Trump and the Republican Party that when they go, could they do to Israel and to us the same thing what, in effect, Trump has done to Obama, which is basically eviscerate practically everything he's put into place with this? He left some remnants of the health care bill. But can the blowback, the swing of the pendulum, be just as mighty as with as much energy as it's gone to the right, go back to the left? And then are we making a mistake by embracing him so wholeheartedly?
Well, I think that, again, politics is reactionary in this moment. And I think that the reason people are embracing Trump so wholeheartedly is because Obama was wildly anti-Israel to the point of anti-Semitism. I mean, the Obama administration embraced a deal with a murderous anti-Jewish regime and celebrated that deal and castigated anyone who disagreed with that deal, and then tried to deprive Israel of the means to defend itself in the middle of a war with Hamas. So the fact that Trump is very pro-Israel, why wouldn't people resonate to that? I mean, I certainly see why people resonate, and I don't see it as, well, now look at all these Jews who are resonating to Trump. That's going to cause the left to move in an anti-Israel direction. I was there in 2012 at the Democratic National Convention when the Democrats booed God in Jerusalem in the DNC platform. So they've been moving in this direction a lot longer than Trump has been on the political scene. To try and blame the Democrat move to the left on Israel on Trump is, I think, really short-sighted. Now, the one area where Trump needs to do better and where his success is tied to the state of Israel is if he continues to make himself unpopular and more Democrats get elected, and those Democrats are more radical because they're reacting to Trump, that's bad, right? So you're seeing that with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashid Tlaib and Keith Ellison and Ilhan Omar and this group of new Democrats have decided that it's perfectly fine to be openly anti-Semitic, right? That is not the fault of Trump, but it's the fault of a Trump backlash that is a response to the president, not on Israel, but on ancillary issues. As far as whether Israelis' love for Trump or Jews' love for Trump broadly in the Orthodox community or in the pro-Israel community is going to create a democratic backlash, that's the fault. I'm sorry, that's the fault of Democrats. That's not the fault of the people who like Israel and are happy to stand up for a politician who likes Israel too. If the Democrats want to get on the good side of people who like Israel, they could do something very easy, which is they could stop being wildly anti-Israel for 5 seconds.
Yeah, but when Netanyahu comes and to be embraced this way by the Republicans, it doesn't pay to be so one-sided, recognizing that one side is not going to be in power.
But again, I mean, Netanyahu was actively castigated by Barack Obama during the entirety of the administration, even though Netanyahu publicly was having his defense minister talk about how warm the relationship was with the Democrats. If there were a Democrat in office today, Netanyahu would be trying to work with that person to the best of his ability because Netanyahu is a survivor and he's smart enough to know that a close relationship with the United States is still important. He tried to do that with Obama. It failed. That wasn't because of Netanyahu. It's because Obama is radically anti-Israel. And the same thing is true when it comes to President Trump.
You say Obama was radically anti-Israel. Look, his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, served in the Israeli army. That's a first. We may never have that again, right? His chief of staff, his organization was staffed with Jews. To say he was violently anti-Israel, what do you base? And even to deal with Iran, and clearly, look, I'm Orthodox and I'm pro-Israel, and I have a daughter who have children and grandchildren in Israel. But my point is that when somebody takes the position that it's better to appease Iran, wrongfully or rightfully, certainly doesn't make them anti-Israel.
It makes you anti-Israel when you are embracing a lie that the regime has moderated, specifically in order to create a deal that turns Iran into more of a regional power so that they can fund terrorism. You ignore all of the negative effects of your deal, including the green lighting of a long-range missile program, and then you proceed to try to cut off aid to Israel in the middle of the Gaza war in 2014. As far as Rahm Emanuel...
Go back. Are you suggesting that Obama wanted more terrorism in the world? wanted Iranians to have long-term missiles? I mean, is Obama like some Soviet plant?
No, I'm suggesting that Barack Obama did not care as much about the safety and security of the future of Israel as of creating what he saw as a regional power balance that reduced Israel in the region, reduced Saudi Arabia in the region, and upheld Iran as a center in the balance of power.
Yeah, but
so he was willing to ignore a bunch of...
But isn't that balance of power because he felt for world peace, a balance of... Look, when we invaded Iraq, everybody thought it was the most brilliant thing, wiping it. It hasn't proved to be such a brilliant thing. I mean, it's very nuanced. Peace in the Middle East.
That's fine. That's fine. That's a change of topic, but that's fine. But
I don't mean,
that I'm making...
I mean, say it's very nuanced. A balance of power could be good for Israel. You could understand somebody... A balance of power with Iran is not good for Israel. There is no balance of power with Iran. But could you
and Obama actively had his national security advisor Ben Rhodes lie to the American people about the Iran deal in order to sell it, and he had his allies lie about Republicans in order to sell it. But
Ben, can't you see Obama believing that, as many believe, that a deal with Iran stabilized the region, and stabilization of the region is good for Israel? Now, you could disagree with his logic and whatever his command is and whatever you're telling him, but to take the next step and say, since he believed that, it's anti-Semitism, I'm not connecting those dots.
I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the Iran deal is inherently anti-Semitism. I'm saying that if you enable your entire administration to lie about the Iran deal and to target opponents of the Iran deal as wanting war, and to suggest that there are no downsides to the...
That could be bad politics, but it's not anti-Semitic.
The anti-Semitic part of the anti-Semitic elements of the Obama administration is in the middle of the 2014 war when they actively decide to deprive Israel of its means for self-defense in order to pressure Israel to make a deal with the terrorist group. That's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that could be.
Okay, and again, the fact is that while they later denied the story, the fact is that early on in the Obama administration, there were very credible reports that were differentially reported about Rahm Emanuel approaching Jews in a Jewish context, telling them that if they did not start making concessions to the Palestinians, then he would be pushing the Iran deal. I remember that he denied it later.
Is Rahm Emanuel anti-Semitic then?
No, Rahm Emanuel is a politically left hack who is willing to do what... This is why I say that leftist anti-Semitism merges with generalized leftism, with mainstream leftism in policy, if not in intent. So I don't know that Barack Obama is in intent an anti-Semite, although I don't know how you sit in Jeremiah Wright's church for 20 years hearing slanders about Jews and get away with it. I mean, that's an unbelievable thing to me.
You wouldn't say Rahm Emanuel is anti-Semitic, right?
No, I wouldn't say Rahm Emanuel is anti-Semitic. I'd say that Rahm Emanuel is a sucker.
So I'm saying at the very least what we could have is misguided people. But I think there's a stretch between misguided people and anti-Semitism.
Right, and what I've said is that the Obama administration's activities were in effect anti-Semitic, which
they
were in 2014.
Even though it may have been well-intentioned.
Right. Well, again, this is where I think that the ADL and so many folks on the left begin to lose the thread, is the suggestion that well-intentioned people who then pursue policies that end with the death of more Jews are preferable to people who are badly intentioned and are ineffective. Like, badly intentioned and ineffective is less of a threat to the Jews worldwide than people who are well-intentioned on the left, who are willing to make common cause with the Iranians.
Ben, I agree with everything you're saying, but what I don't connecting the dots is I'm saying if I were the leader of the world and I said, stabilizing the Middle East is the most important thing, and yes, everybody in the neighborhood is a beneficiary. I could be wrong. When I believe that Rahm Emanuel says, making concessions to the Palestinians is good for the state of Israel, which many people, including many Israeli leaders, have believed. Now, I may disagree with them, but it certainly doesn't make them anti-Semitic. At the very worst, it says, look, they're inept leaders and therefore cause to the bloodshed. But I'm just not connecting the dots to anti-Semitism.
Well, again, I think that I'm not saying Rahm Emanuel is an anti-Semite. I have my doubts about Barack Obama and his general take on the Jewish people. Again, after you sit in Jeremiah Wright's church for 20 years, I don't know a Republican politician on planet Earth who would be able to sit in a church for 20 years in which Judaism was derided in the way that Jeremiah Wright derided Judaism and get away with it. It just would not happen. It's an insane thing.
But Ben, that's also a jump, because we know that he has, in his 20 years, there were a few statements that he made, but we also know that Obama, notwithstanding his moral character, did not go to church very often. there's a very good likelihood that the occasions he went to church were not the times that Jeremiah said those
he
things.
Called Jeremiah right. He called Jeremiah. I mean, I don't want to rehash the entire Obama
administration.
But he called Jeremiah right his moral. He called Jeremiah right his moral mentor. He did a fundraiser with Rashid Khalidi.
I don't know. I'm just saying, how many?
Rashid Khalidi was the spokesman for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestine Liberation Organization when it was a terrorist group. Right? The LA Times did the tape. This is back in 2008. Like, Barack Obama does not have a good record with the Jews. But again, this is less important to me than the reason this conversation started was the idea that if Bibi Netanyahu or other Jews were nicer to the Democrats, then Israel would be more of a bipartisan issue. And my answer to that is that I think Israel would be more of a bipartisan issue if Democrats were nicer to Israel. I do not think that it is the responsibility of Jews to wine and dine people to not sign on to terrible deals with nuclear-armed powers that shout death to Israel. I think it is the responsibility of moral people not to sign on to those deals in the first place. And then it seems to me that the Jews, particularly, the Jews who are pro-Israel, have not changed their stripes here. It's just that the parties have shifted around them. And by the way, this is what the polls show. What the polls show is that the Democratic Party base has been moving consistently anti-Israel since 2001. This is not a late move. This is not something that happened since Trump. It's not something that happened since Obama. It exacerbated from 2008 on. But there's been a separation between the Republican feelings about Israel and the Democratic feelings about Israel, dating back mainly to 9/11, when there was, nearly even support. It was still heavier Republican than Democrat, but at least a majority of Democrats still supported Israel. That began to part around 9/11, when the Democrats began to embrace a different model of thinking about foreign policy, in which Israel was the key to the entire Middle Eastern crisis, and there was this attempt to understand terrorism by blaming Israel's presence for the spread of Islamic terrorism more broadly.
Ben, you lecture at you speak at a lot of campuses, etc., which the vast majority of education, higher education in the United States is very left, quite anti-Israel. As an Orthodox Jew, do you fear for your grandchildren here in this country? Do you say, I don't see this ending well, or not?
Well, I mean, I certainly fear that the intersectional politics that are being pushed on college campuses are very bad for Jews. And as that becomes more and more exacerbated, I have fears, not just for Jews, but for the country as a whole. I think that as the Jews go, to the extent that they are a successful minority group in the United States, the possibility of the country falling apart as well grows higher, because the Jews are always a canary in the coal mine for this sort of stuff. And the fact that what you're seeing from the intersectional left is a forcible expulsion of anti-Semitism from the list of hatreds that are unacceptable, that's a very scary thing. I mean, when you see when you see the intersectional left basically hail Linda Sarsour at the same time Linda Sarsour is hailing Louis Farrakhan, that's a real problem. I do think there's a backlash beginning. I think people are tired of this. I think people are tired of being divided by group identity, and I think that there will be a backlash. But I think that we're going to have to be beyond the Trump administration for that to happen. I think that we're probably 12 to 15 years away from a serious backlash to the radical left push that's being made in the country right now. I think the radical left has been identified with the anti-Trump left, and that may be strong enough to return them to power, but I think there will be a backlash to the backlash.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.